Welcome to a new episode of Leipzig Studies in Religion. In this series, we present publications by researchers from the Institute for the Study of Religion at Leipzig University.
Today, we are diving deep into a fascinating article by Christoph Kleine. It's called Who Invented Buddhism? Or What Was Buddhism Before It Was Called Buddhism?
And this piece comes from a 2025 Routledge volume, Conceptualizing Islam, Current Approaches.
That's the one.
Okay, so let's unpack this central debate because it's a big one. The prevailing idea, the one from post-colonial critique, is that the very concept of Buddhism is basically a modern Western invention.
Exactly. That it, along with words like Hinduism or even religion itself, was sort of imposed on Asia by 19th century European scholars.
So they basically looked at all these diverse traditions and just drew a box around them and slapped a label on it.
A label that didn't exist before. And the mission of this deep dive is to really challenge that view.
Right. To ask, okay, was there something there already? Did pre-colonial Asian practitioners, did they see themselves as part of a single unified tradition?
A tradition they could name and defend and trace back through history. That's the core question.
Now, we should be clear, that initial critique has a lot of merit, doesn't it? This idea of epistemic violence.
Oh, absolutely. The critique is well-founded. Applying these big, universal Western concepts can absolutely erase local ways of understanding the world.
But there's a risk in going too far the other way.
There is, and the research points this out very clearly. If you attribute everything to the West, you end up giving the West this sort of hyper-agency.
And you ignore the agency of non-Western actors.
You ignore their own intellectual traditions, their own ways of categorizing the world, which they developed over a very, very long time.
Okay, so if we can't just look for a perfect one-to-one translation of the word Buddhism, how do we even start? How do we prove they thought of themselves as a unified group?
Well, you have to look past simple linguistics and start looking for implicit concepts of social identity. The research lays out 4 essential factors, 4 criteria, for telling if a tradition saw itself as a single distinct thing.
All right, this is the framework for our whole discussion. What are they?
First, you need some kind of internal unity or inclusion, a common core. Second, you need external closure or exclusion, a way to say, we are this and not that.
Okay, an inside and an outside.
Right. Third is temporal continuity, a sense of a shared past stretching across generations. And fourth, spatial expansion, an awareness that this community exists across different lands and languages.
That makes perfect sense. So let's start with number 1, internal unity. What was the glue holding it all together?
The glue, the absolute symbolic core, is the concept of the Taratna, the 3 jewels.
The 3 jewels.
It's the one thing all Buddhists everywhere take refuge in. It's the shared foundation.
And those are?
The Buddha, the awakened one, the Dharma, that's his teaching, pronounced Dharma, and the Sangha, his order of followers. That's Sangha.
So by taking refuge in those 3, you're in the club, so to speak.
You are identifying with the tradition regardless of what school you belong to or where you live. It's the universal entry point. It provides that undeniable internal cohesion.
Okay, so that's inclusion. Now for the flip side, which is maybe even more telling, exclusion. How do they build the fences, especially in a place like China with its own ancient traditions?
This is where it gets really clever, and it happened fast. As soon as Buddhism arrived in China, after the 2nd century, scholars there had to figure out how to classify it.
Right, next to Confucianism, Rujiao, and Taoism, Dojia.
Exactly. So they developed this really sophisticated system. They called their own scriptures Naiying.
Naijing, what does the nei part mean?
Nei means inner. So these were the inner scriptures, or the inner canon. That label immediately set their texts apart as central and, well, as the truth.
Which implies everything else is.
Outer. Exactly. All other traditions, including the big Chinese ones, were called Waijiao, outer teachings, or they were said to follow the Weidao, the outer path.
And that term Weidao is actually a translation, isn't it?
It is, and this is fascinating. It's a translation of the Sanskrit term Tirthika, which means a ford crosser.
A ford crosser? What a strange image. What's that about?
It implies that, sure, these other paths are also trying to get to the other shore, to liberation. They're crossing the river of suffering. But they're using a different ford, a different and by implication less effective route than the one the Buddha laid out.
Wow. So it's not just a simple us versus them. It's a really nuanced, sophisticated way of defining their own path as the central one.
It's a profound statement of self-identity. It establishes that external closure right from the beginning.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because that self-identity wasn't just philosophical. It became deeply social and historical. Let's talk about that third criterion, temporal continuity.
Right. And the main metaphor they used in East Asia for this was all about family. They saw themselves as a clan, a shi, or a family, a jia, or a descent community, a zong.
A family, that's a powerful idea.
It's the key to everything. And they didn't just talk about it, they wrote it down. They created these huge historiographical works,
Yeah.
like the Shimen Zengtong, which basically means the correct genealogy of the Sikya community.
And they didn't just write their history any old way.
No, not at all. They borrowed the most powerful format they could find. The structure of Chinese imperial history, the dynastic annals, the model established by the great historian Sima Qian.
You're kidding. So they wrote their spiritual history as if it were a royal dynasty.
That is precisely what they did. For instance, in the basic annals, the Bunji, the section that was reserved only for emperors,
Yes.
they put the Indian patriarchs.
Wow. So they're equating their spiritual founders with emperors. That's a massive claim of legitimacy.
A huge claim. And then for the patriarchs of their own influential Chinese schools, like the Tiantai school, they listed them in the hereditary houses, the Shiji. That's the section for the great noble families who serve the emperor.
So they are literally writing themselves into the power structure of China as this ancient noble clan that just happens to originate in India.
That's the foundational claim. The whole order, the Sikha, is one big clan founded by Shakyamuni with its authority based on these two parallel lines of succession, the teaching and the ordination.
And you mentioned this was almost biological in its conception.
It was. They even used the term suimai, which means blood vessels, to describe the transmission of the Dharma. It was a living, unbroken connection flowing through time.
That is so powerful. Let's dig into those two lines of succession. First, the institutional one, the ordination lineage, or Chuanji.
Right, and the things they did to keep this line unbroken are just mind-boggling. They show how critical this unified identity was. Take the case of trying to set up a proper order of nuns in China in the 5th century.
It had to be proper, not just any old ordination.
Precisely. For it to be legitimate, it had to be performed by nuns who were already part of that unbroken lineage going back to the Buddha, and they didn't have any in China.
So what did they do? Send for help.
They launched what you could call an intercontinental spiritual mission. They had to arrange for fully ordained nuns to be shipped all the way from Sri Lanka to China.
From Sri Lanka. In the 5th century, that's an incredible journey.
Two separate groups, actually. They arrived in 429 and 433. All that effort, all that danger, just so they could hold the first correct, legitimate ordination ceremony for Chinese nuns in 434.
That proves this was a global identity for them, not just some local custom.
It absolutely does, and you see it again centuries later in Japan.
Okay, what happened there?
Well, in the 8th century, the Japanese monastic community felt their own ordinations were lacking authority. They weren't connected to the main continental lineage. So they invited a hugely respected Chinese master, Janzen, that's Janzen, to come to Japan.
And he came over just to help them out.
He came over, and in the year 754, he established the Central National Ordination Platform, the Jitan, pronounced Jayatan, at the Great Tudeji Temple.
A national platform.
It was a national statement. It was Japan admitting that to be truly legitimate, their monks and nuns had to be officially plugged into this massive trans-regional tradition that started in India.
Incredible. So institutional legitimacy was imported. What about the other line, doctrinal succession, the Tuanfecti? This seems especially important for schools like Chan or Zen.
For Chan, it was everything. They were obsessed with genealogies, tracing this unbroken line of enlightenment from master to student. They called it Chuandong, the transmission of the lamp.
But what happens if that line is, a bit fuzzy, if there's a gap in the historical record?
Well, that's when you see the power of creating your own story.
Right.
If a direct succession wasn't there, sometimes they had to construct it through myth.
Give me an example.
Husman, the founder of the Japanese Pure Land school, Jidoshu. He didn't have a direct teacher-student link to the Chinese master he admired most, Shandao. So what did he do?
I have no idea.
He claimed that Shandao appeared to him in a dream and personally validated his teachings.
A dream? That counts.
It counted. It was a miraculous validation that bridged the gap across centuries and borders. It shows how vital it was to have that connection, even a supernatural one.
Which brings us perfectly to the fourth criterion, spatial expansion. They were clearly aware they were part of something huge and international.
It was fundamental to their identity. I mean, for a Chinese text to even be considered authentic, to be Neigyo, an inner teaching, you had to prove it was a translation from an Indian language.
So foreignness was actually a stamp of approval.
It was the ultimate stamp of legitimacy. And this wasn't just for scholars. You see it in high-level diplomacy.
Like what?
In the mid-6th century, the king of a Korean kingdom, Baekje, wrote a letter to the Japanese emperor, Tenyu Kinmei. That's Kinmei.
Okay.
And he explicitly says that this wonderful Buddhist doctrine has spread all the way from distant India, which they called Tianzu, through the Korean kingdoms, and that everyone is embracing it. It's framed as this amazing international movement.
And Japan's own foundational texts say the same thing.
They do. Shutoku Taishi's constitution from the 7th century says the three treasures are the supreme objects of faith in all countries. The civilized world, in their view, was the Buddhist world.
And the travelogues of the great pilgrims, they must have cemented this idea.
They made it real. They weren't just traveling, they were mapping the Dharma world. Think of Faxian in the early 5th century. He crosses Central Asia, goes to India and Sri Lanka, and writes about 30 different kingdoms he visited.
He's drawing the map of their community.
Or Xuanzang, who studied at the Great Nalanda Monastery in India. His records describe the geography and culture of 110 different countries and city-states.
110.
He's confirming that this tradition is incredibly diverse, but it's still one unified tradition. And then there's Yizheng, who took the sea route and described Buddhism flourishing in South, Southeast, East, and Central Asia. The sheer scale of these journeys is breathtaking.
And this wasn't just for the elites, it filtered down into popular culture, too.
It really did. There's a famous Japanese collection of stories, the Konjaku Monogatari Shu, Tales of Times Now Past. It has over 1,000 tales. And how does it organize them? Geographically. A section for India, Sansu, a section for China, Zindan, and a section for Japan, Yanchao. They saw their world as this interconnected, three-part cultural sphere defined by Buddhism.
Okay, so we have unity, exclusion, continuity, and expansion. It seems like a pretty solid case. So let's circle back to that big linguistic objection from Wilfred C. Smith. Why did he claim there were no words for Buddhists in Chinese or Japanese?
He was, to be blunt, mistaken. Or at least he was looking for a kind of perfect semantic equivalence that, almost never exists between languages. The terms were there, and they were used all the time.
What were they?
The main ones were Fojia and Shijia.
And they both mean what exactly?
The house or family of the Buddha or of Shukya. That word ji can mean family, but it can also mean a philosophical school or a professional group. It perfectly describes a community dedicated to the Buddha's path.
And these terms weren't just used inside the monasteries.
Not at all. Even non-Buddhist authorities use them. The King Emperor's massive encyclopedia from the late 18th century has sections that explicitly contrast the Shiji, the Buddhists, with the Ruji, the Confucians, and the Daoji, the Taoists. They were clearly seen as a distinct group.
But the most powerful piece of evidence is something that practitioners did themselves, right?
Absolutely. The ultimate identity marker. When monks and nuns were ordained, they dropped their family surname.
They gave up their old name.
And they all adopted a new one. Shi, which is the Chinese transliteration of Shukya.
So they were literally joining the Shukya clan.
They were publicly and permanently signaling that they now belonged to this enormous trans-regional extended family founded by the Buddha.
So what does this all mean when we put it all together?
It means that the whole Western invention argument needs a major rethink. Yes, the English word Buddhism is modern, but the idea that there was no cohesive identity, no name for the tradition, before the West showed up, it's just not supported by the evidence.
For the educated people shaping the tradition.
For them, Buddhism was a very real, concrete thing. It was a coherent tradition spreading across regions with an unbroken history they could trace right back to Shakyamuni in India. They defined it, they defended it, and they built their identity around it.
It really flips the narrative and gives agency back to Asian thinkers and practitioners. Okay, here's a final thought for you to chew on. We've talked about this intense focus on unbroken lineage, on needing texts from India to be legitimate. How did pre-modern Asian Buddhists deal with that tension? The tension between having to honor a foreign origin, India, while at the same time creating their own powerful local traditions like Tiantai or Zen that, frankly, sometimes became even more important than the Indian sources.
That is the great creative tension of the whole tradition, isn't it? How to stay true to a universal heritage while also creating your own local genius.
Thank you for listening, and we hope to welcome you back for another episode of our series, Leipzig Studies in Religion.